Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniela Caruso. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Europe here at Boston University. It is a pleasure and it is my honor to host today here at the center for the second time Ambassador Ischinger, who was the German ambassador to the United States between 2000 and 2006. As respondents, discussants to the presentation by Ambassador Ischinger, we are having today Vesko Garčević, who is professor of the practice of international relations at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. He joined the BU community in July 2016 after a distinguished diplomatic career. He held important positions at the time of the dissolution of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and worked on the democratic transition of Montenegro. From 2010 to 2014, Vesko Garčević was ambassador of Montenegro to NATO, as well as the bilateral Montenegro ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. He also served as ambassadors of Serbia and Montenegro at the OSCE in Vienna. Professor Kaija Schilde. Professor Kaija Schilde is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies. Her research interests involve the political economy of security and transatlantic security. Her book, The Political Economy of European Security, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, investigates the state-society relations between the EU and interest groups, with a particular focus on security and defense institutions, industries, and markets. Her work spans multiple dimensions of the historical institutionalism of security organizations, including military spending and the international diffusion of internal and border security practices. I very much look forward to this discussion. Professor Garčević, please.
Thank you, Daniela. I would like also, on behalf of the Center for the Study of Europe and Pardee School, to welcome Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. Good evening, Ambassador, and good afternoon to everybody. Ambassador Ischinger has a good knowledge of the region I come from, as he has been involved in some of the most critical events for peace and stability of the Balkans, and I will mention it later on a little bit more. But at this point, I would like to introduce why we are here. First of all, and the main reason is the new book published recently, lately, written by Ambassador Ischinger, World in Danger, Germany and Europe in an uncertain time. The world is living a turbulent time, we all know that. Tensions between the US and China threaten the resumption of great power conflict. Global institutions are being tested as never before. And the rising nationalism and populism have re-emerged as a major force in both democracies and authoritarian states. Against this backdrop, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, one of the most prominent, not only German, but I would say European diplomats, discusses in his book the way forward, offering a vision of a European future of peace and stability. And also he examines the root causes of the current conflict and suggests how Europe can successfully address the most urgent challenges of our time. But before giving floor to Ambassador Ischinger, I would like to document why I think he is one of the most prominent diplomats in Europe and in Germany and Europe. So his career, diplomatic career and career in general is very impressive. He has been the chairman of the Munich Security Conference since 2008. Munich Security Conference, in my view, is the best security conference in the world. I was privileged to participate in its work only once in 2011. Ambassador Ischinger teaches at the Pardee School of Governance in Berlin as senior professor for security policy and diplomatic practice. He is a member of Trilateral Commission and the European Council on Foreign Relations. He is also a member of the German Council of Foreign Relations, the American Academy Berlin, and the Atlantic Brücke, which is Atlantic Bridges. He served, as you said, in German Foreign Service since 1975, and he had a distinguished diplomatic career. You mentioned that he was ambassador in the US between 2001 and 2006. After that, he served as a German ambassador in London between 2006 and 2008. He was deputy foreign minister and political director of the foreign ministry. He also, that brings me to the region I come from, you know, he was in 2007 part of European Union Troika that negotiated the future of Kosovo. And back in time in 1995, he was the member of German delegation during the Bosnian peace negotiation in Dayton, Ohio. And also he was one of those who negotiated the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1996 and 1997. In a nutshell, I would say he has taken part in events that have shaped the modern history of Europe. Therefore, we don't have better person to speak about future of Europe. Now I'm looking forward to Ambassador Ischinger presentation, and also looking forward to thought-provoking discussion following the presentation. Ambassador Ischinger, floor is yours, and looking forward to it. Once again, welcome to our school.
Thank you so much. What a privilege. And thank you so much for this very warm and kind introduction. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to our discussion in a few minutes. But before I try to talk a little bit about the challenges ahead, I want to just share with you one or two personal items. First, you mentioned, and thank you for mentioning it, that I had the privilege of serving my country in the United States beginning in 2001. But the determining moment was that, believe it or not, my wife and I arrived on a flight from Berlin in the evening of September the 10th, 2001. In other words, my first working day in Washington happened to be 9/11. Now, in other words, I know, because I was there, I know what happened. I saw with my own eyes from my new office window in the German embassy in Washington. I saw this black cloud of smoke coming up from the burning Pentagon, and that, of course, it sort of determined the content of my entire ambassadorial tour in the United States. Second, a small comment is some years ago in 2014, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Munich Security Conference, and I published a book, which you can see here, called Towards Mutual Security. And believe it or not, who wrote a congratulatory message as an introduction to this book? A gentleman by the name of Joe Biden. And in the first paragraph of this piece, he said, and I quote, "I first went to the Munich Security Conference in 1980. That was 40 years ago, when it was still known as Wehrkunde. Wehrkunde is the German word for the science of military conduct, etc. So I'm really happy to say that the president-elect of the United States is probably not only going to be the most important, but probably also the longest serving supporter of the Munich Security Conference in the years to come. And that makes me, as the organizer of the activities of the Munich Security Conference, makes me a very happy man. Now, that takes me into our subject matter. Now, I don't recall a moment in recent international history where we had more simultaneous challenges than at this current moment, of course, with the pandemic overshadowing everything else. So what I want to do in the next maybe 15 minutes or so is to talk about three issues. One, about the dramatic change, the dramatic end of an era, and the uncertain beginning of a new era that we are currently witnessing. Second, the consequences, the secondary consequences of the on the global scale of the pandemic, we tend in our societies, you on the American side, we here in Europe, we tend to be, for good reasons, primarily focused on what's happening to our own folks, who is in the hospital, what happens to the infection rates, etc., and how can we reduce the consequences for our economies, etc. What we have not paid enough attention to, and I'll talk about that for a few minutes, is what the secondary consequences of this pandemic will be for the rest of the world, not only for the transatlantic community. And third and last, I want to say a few words, obviously, because this is what's mostly on our minds. What's going to be the consequences of the election victory of Joe Biden? How do we in Europe, how should we and how will we hopefully welcome this next American administration? So these are the three things. First, the dramatic end of an era and the beginning of a new one. You know, from a German point of view, almost all the things which we have tended to consider certainties, sort of cast in stone, are now associated with a big question mark. Let me give you a few examples. For the last 50 years, my generation, and I think also the younger generations, tended to think that the nuclear umbrella, the security protection offered by the United States, certainly for Western Europe and increasingly to Europe, was going to exist forever. Now, we know from history that nothing is really forever, but the idea was that we didn't need to worry about that. Now, because of what President Trump has said over the last 3.5 years, serious question marks have been associated with the idea of, you know, NATO's future, the validity of the American nuclear guarantee for the security of Western Europe. So that certainty of our military security has been eroded. Second, in the EU treaty, you find the term of the ever closer union as a definition of the ultimate goal, of the ambition of the member states of what was the European Community, what is now the European Union, the ever closer union. Well, you know, I participated as a diplomat in a number of negotiations on the future of the EU, in the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s, and at various subsequent negotiations leading up to the last edition of the treaty, which we call the Lisbon Treaty. Now, the certainty of ever closer union has been blown to pieces, of course, by what? By Brexit and by certain developments within the EU. Very difficult, ongoing, current discussions about how we should interpret the rule of law, and how we want to uphold the principles of democracy and the rule of law in the European Union. And let me give you a third element. My good friend Bob Zoellick, former Deputy Secretary of State, former President of the World Bank, a number of years ago spoke about our expectation, and he got a lot of support from around the world for that, of the expectation that China would end up being a, what he called, quote unquote, a responsible stakeholder of the international system. Turns out, I believe, that yes, of course, China is interested in being a major stakeholder in a international system, in a global order, but I have some doubts whether they want to be a stakeholder in exactly the order that you, the United States, and European allies built in the post-World War II era. In other words, this responsible stakeholder idea is also sort of falling flat on its face. And I could go on and on. In other words, certainties have disappeared. We live in an era of incredible volatilities. And for my own country, for Germany, this has important consequences. There is no country in the world, I believe, that has better known than Germany to benefit from the liberal post-war global order. For us, this idea of globalization, free trade, for us as an export dependent nation, this has been the perfect habitat for German economic and political success. So if this system is now fraying at the edges, is falling apart as we speak because of renewed great power rivalries, United States versus China, a rather aggressive Russian behavior in Eastern and Central Europe and also in the Middle East. We Germans have a lot to lose, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, my second major point is the fallout of the pandemic. As I said in the beginning, of course, our governments, folks in Washington, folks in Berlin, focus on what needs to be done in order to limit the infection rates and how to soften the blow for our economies, etc. The problem is that, as my friend Pascal Lamy, French former head of the WTO, said a few days ago, the resources made available for taking care of the economic fallout of the pandemic, the resources made available for the developed world, for the Northern Hemisphere, so to speak, is 10 times greater than the resources that are going to be made available for the developing world. We are going to release, the Munich Security Conference, we're going to be releasing a report 2 days from now, this week, which we have given the title, The Polypandemic. What does that mean? It means that we believe that there is a 5-fold pandemic as we look going forward. First, there's going to be a hunger pandemic. The number of people suffering from hunger in the world is, according to various estimates, about to double because of the pandemic. There is a poverty pandemic. The number of people in extreme poverty is going to grow, again, according to estimates, by more than 100 million people. There is a pandemic of authoritarianism. We see a rise in state repression and authoritarian behavior, not only in Europe, that is growing. And fourth, there is going to be an inequality pandemic in terms of an opening, even further opening gap of inequality between the rich and the poor in the world, between rich countries and poor countries. Just one number, in the OECD region, that is essentially the Northern Hemisphere, we have 29 doctors on an average for 10,000 people. In the developed world, it's like 3 doctors for 10,000 people on an average. That's where we are. And it is very likely to get a lot worse as a consequence of the pandemic. And last not least, and that is what worries me most as the head of the Munich Security Conference, thinking of international security, we are going to have a pandemic also in terms of insecurity, in terms of radicalization, in terms of increased terrorism, in terms of increased number of failing states in Africa and elsewhere. And that in turn may lead, and probably will lead, to a rise in migratory pressures and will present even more challenges than the ones we've had to face in recent years. So that's the polypandemic. Third and last issue I wanted to briefly discuss is, of course, the result of the US election. Now, let me say that throughout Europe, everybody is more or less euphoric. The Trump years have been seen by most here in Europe as a problem, as a burden, as a dissonant period in transatlantic relations. Now, let me say that my message, and I've done a number of radio and television programs in Europe, in Germany over the last week or so. My message is curb, to my own fellow Germans and fellow Europeans, curb your enthusiasm. Curb your enthusiasm. Joe Biden, for whom I have the greatest respect, I love him. He's been, as I said earlier, he's been a patron. He's the patron saint of the Munich Security Conference. Joe Biden will not be able to perform miracles and to make all the issues that have been burdening the transatlantic relationships go away. Many of these issues predate the Trump administration. The famous issue of transatlantic military burden sharing, for example. Our positions on such institutions as the International Criminal Court, for example. Now, so I believe that it would be the perfectly wrong reaction by Europeans to now sit back and say, thank you very much, Americans, now you've elected Joe Biden to be your next president, and we can now sit back and relax and enjoy the sunshine because Joe Biden will make everything right again and we will go back to a perfectly harmonious transatlantic paradise. That is not going to happen. And that is why my message is to my fellow Europeans, we need to do our homework. We should be coming to Washington, we as the European Union, we should be coming to Washington with a comprehensive offer of cooperation in order to make it easier for the incoming Biden administration to demonstrate to the members of the US Congress and to the American public that this is not a relationship where America only gives and Europe only benefits, but that it is a fair relationship where both sides benefit and where we have ongoing discussions about how we can maximize the outcome of our cooperation. Essentially, and I want to end on that. Essentially, in other words, what will not change so quickly is the issues that we need to deal with on trade, on burden sharing, on the Middle East, on China, on Russia. But what will change is what I call the 3 T's, the 3 T's: trust, truth, and transparency. Trust will be reestablished through the relationship that I am sure this incoming president will be able to easily create with European leaders, from France to Germany to Sweden to Italy and the rest of our fellow Europeans. Truth needs to be reestablished as a fundamental principle of political leadership. we need to re-identify with the truth, and we need to combat really fake news on a grand scale and make sure that we're not going to be taken off the right direction by disinformation and misinformation, which comes mostly not from within the transatlantic community, but which comes from those who want to weaken us rather than to encourage us. So I think there is a wonderful opportunity waiting to be seized by the transatlantic leaders, but it needs to be seized with the awareness that we on the European side have a lot of homework to do. We need to be able to come to, and that would be my last point, we need to come to the United States with a coherent European view on the decisive issues. For example, on China. China, and let me single that one out, China will, in my view, be the single biggest transatlantic challenge in terms of managing differences which obviously exist between American views and European views. Managing these differences will only be possible if we can institutionalize a consultative framework. I participated a few months ago, with my old friend Karen Donfried, the president of the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., in a study which we presented in terms of a report about a month ago on the future of the transatlantic relationship. And one of the important recommendations of this paper was to create a very senior level transatlantic coordination commission, so to speak, a body on the American side to be led, to be chaired, maybe by the Vice President of the United States, in order to elevate it above the various government departments, state, defense, commerce, etc. And on the European side, maybe on a joint committee consisting of the EU and of NATO and of important member states. So we need to give thought to how we can organize and improve a transatlantic relationship which is of core interest to Europeans. And I hope, and I'm quite confident, that President-elect Biden would agree with that, which is a transatlantic relationship which is also of significant and critical importance to the security and the prosperity of the United States. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Professor Garčević.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger, for your thoughtful remarks. Allow me now to reflect on some of your points and to pose a few questions. Let me begin with what you described as the time of uncertainty or the world of uncertainty. Personally, I agree with you. I think that we are living the time after a big earthquake. If we go deep back into history, I still see waves coming out from the end of bipolar world. Following the end of bipolar world, we were living unprecedented time of peace that some described as the end of history, but history is back. As Ian Bremmer described this time, he used the parallel, calling it the G0 world or G0 power vacuum, where no country emerged as a clear leader, and we are experiencing some type of power competition. I agree that the number of pandemics that you outlined, hunger pandemic, poverty pandemic, authoritarianism as a pandemic. In March 2018, the World Bank published a report stating that the global describing the global implication of climate change and the potential for massive population displacement. According to the report, which echo what you mentioned, World Bank predicts as many as 143 million people to be displaced by 2050 due to climate change related phenomena, which has a security implication, as you said, implication on poverty, on food supply, energy supply, and so on and so forth. Then in this context, my question would be, but I will comment on some other points you made, but just I would like to make sure that I have questions regarding it. I think that we are still living in a state-centric system. States are still center of global affairs, international relations. And the question is how much this state-centric system is efficient to address human-centric security threats, the ones that you mentioned. How can we go beyond the acknowledgement of challenges, we all agree on them, towards more coherent cooperation at the global level? What is the role of international organizations, the UN, how you can envisage multilateralism in the future? That would be one question from my side. The second, I will reflect on what you said, trust, truth, and transparency. Again, I agree very much what you mentioned. This inspired me to look at Chancellor Merkel's speech from a couple of days ago. I find this speech exemplary, and also it's good to see how somebody in a 4-minute speech may touch upon very important issues from the German history, including Kristallnacht, the role of the US in Germany after the end of the World War II, and the importance of strategic partnership between Germany and the US, not only for those two countries, but for Europe and the world. I agree that Europeans after Biden, including my region, expect miracles and the US to come back and the US robust involvement in local affairs. But as you said, I agree, Americans are not fixers by default, and it is an illusion to, and sometimes reflect a failure to take responsibility for your own affairs, to expect others, including Americans, to fix all your problems. So yeah, I agree that we will see maybe more conventional US approach to its European partners, and the US to nurture relations with your country and France, definitely two strategic allies on the continent. But my question would be, you know, when you think about the future, not just about next 4 years, but the future of US and European Union relations, what you consider as the most challenging issue? Trade deal or trade relations, defense spending, or something which we can call European security architecture, developed or built by Europeans, run by Europeans in harmony or in synergy with Europe, with the US, or it is relations with China, as you just explained, or it is maybe more European stuff, but also touches American interests. It's your relation or relations with Russia, because Russia is still in the courtroom, in the courtyard also, and that definitely make an impact on not just European relations and relations between Europeans within the EU, but also US and Europe. That, and finally, in that context, how you see Germany? I know those are several questions, not just two, but I would say they touch one another, and I would really like to hear your points on it. Once more again, I would like to make sure that there will be more questions from our audience afterwards, but now I would like to turn the floor to my colleague Kaija. She will shed light on your remarks from more, let's say, academic perspective.
Thank you so much, Vesko. Professor Kaija Schilde, please.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Vesko, and welcome, Ambassador Ischinger. I actually prepared some thoughts because to ask you about your book, because I read it over the weekend and enjoyed it very much. and appreciated your comments so much right now. But I wanted to actually ask you a couple questions that related to a deep reading of your book. And I'll summarize it a little bit for the people viewing, so it isn't something that they don't have knowledge about while I'm asking. I particularly enjoyed this first-person insight and narrative, especially from backroom discussions in different moments of foreign policy, including discussions around German national identity, German reunification, former Yugoslavia and the Dayton Accords, 9/11 and the Iraq War, and Russia-European relations. These are all topics I follow very closely, but they are topics whose kind of core truths or core narratives are sometimes missing. It's hard to read something like what I read in your book. They're still highly sensitive stories of people who are often still in power, and not all decision makers have written about it the way you have. And they're also too recent for kind of rigorous academic treatment, especially by historians using primary materials. So I feel quite lucky to have read this narrative of the last few decades. I also appreciated it's a rare perspective across important moments, but also feels deeply human. Thank you for that. I appreciated all the stories of first-person experiences as a diplomat, as an ambassador, but also linking things to the local of your hometown on the Neckar. It created a nice narrative for the book. So I had two big questions about the book, and they are maybe a little bit academic, maybe a little bit more academic but they really provoked interesting thoughts in my mind, and I wanted to ask you. So the first one came up for me in the introduction, which is a very interesting tour, a very impressive tour of all the major disruptions and shifts in international and domestic politics in recent history, such as increasing inequality, less freedom or fewer democracies, reduction in objective truths and civic trust, or potentially greater risk of wars. There was also a fascinating subsection in the book that I really picked up on, saying that there's overall like a loss of predictive power for decision makers to predict outcomes. There's less there for national decision makers to work with, which I thought was so fascinating. And you said the examples of that policymakers were unable to foresee the Ukraine crisis in 2014, the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, Brexit in 2016, a crisis with Qatar in 2017. And that just sounded so interesting to me. And it really provoked thoughts in my mind, as in why, what compared to what, and compared to when has this changed? Is there an inflection point that you can point to about changes in this loss of predictive power? When was it easier to predict, or at least when did decision makers feel they had better options in front of them for predictive power would be a better comparison. And also it made me think, who makes these predictive national security decisions? It's not politicians, it's national security and intelligence bureaucracies staffed by civil servants, and at least historically nonpartisan. We have threats to that right now, but that's very recent. New administrations or new politics only shifts these bureaucracies around the margins, really, not significantly. So what explains this decay in predictive ability of these bureaucracies? It really made me think. I mean, a lot of people might say that the world is now too uncertain for prediction or too complex, but I'm not a historian, but I would probably push back. I think at all points in time, people often say, wow, we're living in interesting times. I mean, I think we really are living in interesting times right now, but I don't think that's new, and I don't think complexity and uncertainty is new. And so it made me think about all the other possibilities, like, is there a change in how intelligence assessments are created, like different methodologies, how they're communicated to policymakers, channels and processes? Has the relationship between politicians and bureaucracies changed due to populism? Maybe in some places, and maybe very, very recently, but not over the last 30 years, more recently. And it makes me think about evidence that the capacity of national security bureaucracies has actually been decaying. Indeed, there are studies showing that bureaucracies aren't what they used to be in the advanced industrial world. And even national security bureaucracies are not as capable anymore as they were 30 or 40 years ago. And it's attributed to lower tax bases, lower fiscal spending, more non-discretionary spending, eating up defense budgets, more outsourcing of activities that used to be done by the state. This is even true in the United States, and especially in the United States, even with high defense spending. What the state used to do is declining. It's now done by firms and consultancies and industries rather than civil servant capacity and bureaucracies. So that's my first question. And then I have a second question. And that is, I was fascinated by, at the end of your book, and I think the second to last chapter, how you talked about the necessity of developing a German National Security Council. And this reflects a very important debate that you've been at the center of, how to design domestic institutions in Germany to match the increasing importance of the German role in the world. And there currently is a disconnect between German power and responsibilities and kind of the German domestic production of strategic thought. And you have a very specific diagnosis of this problem, which is fascinating for me as an institutionalist, that there's a lack of an institution like a National Security Council in Germany that would be pretty insular, pretty protected from politics in some ways, very, well-developed strategic thought, a place for that, kind of an internal think tank in government, and also in a lack of strategic culture in Germany. And your solution is to transform the existing Federal Security Council into a more robust strategic body. And it would just, it would be a pretty easy reform. Indeed, I was fascinated by the fact that you also proposed it back in 1998 already. So this is not your new idea. This has been something going on for a while. And it occurred to me, it made me think again about all the times I've been in Berlin and everyone complains about a lack of a strategic political culture. But it actually has, for the last decade, been a very robust conversation in Berlin. Anytime I go, it seems like it has a very healthy strategic political culture. It's just happening outside government, in think tanks and in other informal institutions, or sometimes it's happening in Munich and not Berlin. So that really was thought-provoking for me. And so my question about this was, what do you think the impediments to this organizational reform are? Are they the same as when you originally proposed it in 1998, or is it closer to reality or further from reality? And I just had a corollary to that thought. And it made me think about how some historians have said that the United States has the strategic institutions it has, like the National Security Council, or like RAND, which is non-governmental, but it's government related, that it has these foreign policy institutions precisely because of lessons learned from Germany. These institutions, particularly RAND, were formed by Jewish emigres to the United States, who very explicitly said they wanted to create institutions that were anti-democratic for foreign policy, so insulated from kind of, the terrifying public opinion that could turn fascist and could influence foreign policy. And it was their direct diagnoses of what went wrong in Weimar Germany, that the public potentially had too much to say in the high politics of foreign policy. And so they designed US institutions to kind of be insulated from fascism, essentially. And that's why the US has those institutions. It made me think about that just right before this talk. And so what's interesting is that Germany has not insulated itself from the public opinion the way the US has. Indeed, some of what's going on in Germany is this public opinion constraint on foreign policy. And so if the United States had a parliamentary system and it did not have a strong executive branch institutions like the National Security Council, its foreign policy might actually look more like Germany's, because US and German public opinion are more alike than not in foreign policy attitudes. In general, people don't like interventions. They prefer lower military spending. They want to only give aid to democracies. And even both US and German elite opinion is more liberal world order oriented and diverges from public opinion. But in the US, this elite opinion has a home, in like RAND or the NSC, and in Germany it does not. And so as an institutionalist, as an academic, that's fascinating to me. And so I'm curious to hear your response.
Thank you so much, Kaija. Wonderful. We have so many questions, but I just can't refrain from asking just one more. Okay, and then Vesko, please take over with the moderation of the additional questions. I just wanted to to ask you something about your depiction of the transatlantic paradise, as you named it, that was lost, right? So, and there was a lot in your talk about the need to rebuild, to reconstruct, to revert, to reestablish, etc. And that's that part of your talk that struck me. My question is, is there something that you wouldn't want to reconstruct, to bring back? In other words, is there any kind of, in your diagnosis of the reasons why we lost that transatlantic paradise that was so highly beneficial to Germany and others, is there something that Germany, Europe, the EU, should have done differently, and some errors that we really should be very careful not to make again as we rebuild, reconstruct, etc. I'll stop here.
All right. Wow. Thank you very much. It's a good list of very interesting issues. I know we are limited for time, so let me try to touch on, I hope, on more or less all of them very briefly. First, the first question was about, a system that is essentially determined by the relationships between states and the role of non-state actors. I believe that, let me make a very practical remark. When I took over the chairmanship of the Munich Security Conference more than a decade ago, it was to a certain extent still possible to conduct a discussion about strategic security issues between generals, members of parliaments, the government executives, and a couple of professors. Today, it is not possible to limit a discussion, an intelligent discussion about global and regional security issues to this particular audience or this particular group of participants. Today, you need the technology companies. Today, you need NGOs because they play an increasingly relevant role in managing and changing the international system. Let me give you just one example. The classic nation state, in our theory, but also in practice, had a monopoly on the use of force. In fact, that is one of the characteristics of the theory of the nation state. It doesn't allow individuals to shoot each other. It says you do not have the right to use force. That is our privilege as the state, the government. Now, this monopoly has, of course, recently been almost totally eroded. We are now seeing groups of people, whether it's terrorists or interest groups, through the use of cyber methods and other technological methods to inflict damage to companies, to institutions, to localities, damage in a way that previously could only be inflicted by, the kinetic energy provided by armies. In other words, the classic nation state is losing the monopoly on force, and that changes the whole story about how our globe is being organized, which is why I think that we really need to give a hard thought to the question are we doing the right thing in terms of having only, quote unquote, states as members of the United Nations? What about the role of those who are not states, but who have budgets that are 10 times bigger than that of most member states of the United Nations? So that's a good question. And I think we need to address this. Now, I want to make a personal remark about, Chancellor Merkel and recent history. And you mentioned her recent speech. This autumn, this fall, you know, the 9th of November is, of course, an important date in German history because it was the day the wall came down 31 years ago. But this year was also the 30th anniversary of Unification, which we celebrated almost exactly a year after the wall came down in October of 1990. And I want to just make the point that we are aware of the fact, and we will not forget it, that this dramatic change in the European landscape and in Germany, the possibility of reunification came about because there was a fundamental relationship of trust and cooperation between then President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, and of course, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the time, and their teams, Jim Baker and Genscher, and so on. So, in other words, we will be forever grateful for this degree of support and cooperation, and that's what we want to get back to, this kind of trusting relationship. That allows me to respond to the question of what are we not interested in recreating? That is a question you asked. I think what we do not want to recreate is a sense which dominated German thinking for the first 40 years or so of the post-World War II period, that since we're not entirely sovereign, you know, as a divided country, let the United States and other powers make the difficult decisions, and we focus on our prosperity and on domestic issues. Germany, like any other major country, needs to grow up and accept that it has a responsibility not only vis-a-vis its own citizens, but also to her allies and partners through NATO and through the EU treaties, etc. And that brings me to the question of the, if I may jump ahead to the question which I found very interesting about the National Security Council, which we don't have, and why don't we have it? Well, I mean, I could spend 3 hours talking about that, but I just want to make a couple of points. One of the continuing arguments 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and today, why this is not a good idea, the idea of creating a bureaucratic underpinning, a systematic bureaucratic of foreign policy decisions. One of the key arguments is that we are different from the United States. We're also in principle different from France or also of the United Kingdom, because we always have coalition governments. And a coalition government is built on the idea of compromise. And if you had a National Security Council, that would probably be located in the office of the Chancellor. And therefore you would take away a certain degree of sovereign power of the foreign ministry, which usually goes to the coalition partner. In other words, you would unfortunately change the balance of relative power within such a coalition. I don't think that this is an argument that works anymore. I think it's a wrong argument. But as you can see, we have not yet won this battle about what I think the battle about creating a more strategic underpinning. The other problem that is associated with this is, of course, that you have a presidential system where the president and his administration can make major decisions, not all, but many, without the advice and consent of the Congress. or of the Senate. In the German parliamentary system, we've gone to an extreme. Every decision, especially every military decision, every deployment decision, requires the formal consent of our Bundestag, of the parliament. That is one additional reason why some people in Berlin believe that a formal government body that would systematically prepare decisions would only interfere with the role of the Bundestag and would diminish the role of the Bundestag, the parliamentary role in shaping foreign policy decisions. Now, finally, let me address one question which came up, which I find really interesting. Among the anecdotes which I've tried to discuss in the book is a story, or the narrative about how NATO and Russia tried to figure out an arrangement in the 1990s, which ended up being written down in the so-called Nato-Russia Founding Act. And, I wrote this book not with the intention of writing a textbook or a book for the expert community. The idea, which was proposed to me by my original German publisher, was to explain to the German voter how difficult it is to make good foreign policy decisions, that it is in most cases not a decision about, a wonderfully moral and perfect peace solution as opposed to going to war. It's not usually a black and white choice. It is very often, and this was part of my motivation writing the book, it's mostly about the difficult decision that we have to make between three bad options. And then you have to try to select the least bad option from among the three bad options. And that least bad option may not even be a highly moral one that you can easily defend in front of your public. So trying to explain that things are sometimes really quite complicated. Now, on NATO-Russia, I want to just highlight one point which I have had to talk about forever and ever and ever in the German public. There is, I know this is not so popular in the United States, but there is a lingering theory promoted, of course, by Russia and by Russian propaganda in the German public that when German unification was negotiated, that we, the West, we, the United States and West Germany, we promised to Russia never to enlarge NATO to the East. And voila, of course, we broke they broke this promise, which is why we on the Russian side have a reason to complain. This myth about Russia being betrayed by the West in the post-German unification phase is a myth. And I try to explain why it is a myth in the book by pointing out a very simple fact. I was the chief German negotiator when we negotiated this NATO-Russia Founding Act in the mid-90s, 96. And we negotiated with our Russian colleague, Vice Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, for a number of months. It was not an easy negotiation. It took many months. And not once in these lengthy negotiations did the Russian delegation ever bring up the argument, actually, we shouldn't be sitting here discussing the modalities of NATO enlargement because you guys promised not to enlarge NATO. That argument was not brought up a single time. Never, ever, not at my level, as the head of delegation, not at the working level. In other words, if the Russians had felt in 96 that they had a serious point to make here, I'm sure they would have liked to make it. They are excellent diplomats and very experienced. And especially my Russian colleague at the time, a gentleman by the name of Afanasievsky, was very smart, one of the best they had. He never brought it up. In other words, it didn't exist. And it's very important for us to dispel this myth. So I hope that this particular anecdote and a few others will actually help us get rid of some of the unnecessary disinformation or mythology that surrounds the last couple of decades of our history. I'm sure I have not covered all points. Maybe finally one brief remark on your very interesting question about why is there this loss of predictive power. I am sure that in earlier generations, people also complained that they had very little capacity to predict the future and that they were sometimes wrong. But I think the degree of uncertainty has increased tremendously. And my explanation is that this has to do with two things: with the speed of communication and the multiplication of communication channels, instant communication, which did not exist 30 or 50 years ago. And secondly, that we have significantly more actors in strategic foreign policy decision-making than existed, say, 100 years ago or 50 years ago. When you think about such a recent conflict as the shooting between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Karabakh, it just happened in the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. If you think about how many actors are directly or indirectly involved in such a local conflict, there's Russia, there's the United States, there's the Minsk group that includes then France, there's Turkey, there's Iran, there's the European Union, there's China, and there are any number of Middle Eastern countries who also have relations, because Azerbaijan is a Muslim, has a Muslim population, etc. In other words, the number of parties that get involved directly or indirectly and participate in shaping the outcome is huge. It's increasingly huge in these crisis situations. In former times, it was Great Britain, United Kingdom, maybe Russia, and one or two other decision-making powers that made things happen, created India, the modern India. There were not many other actors. So I think the number of actors has multiplied, and the speed of communication, which exceeds even the speed of our diplomatic communication. I've been fascinated by the fact that even if you're very quick in writing a diplomatic cable home, you will never be able to do it as fast as the news agencies. So the news agencies today, on the internet, are always quicker than you. That makes serious diplomatic work really quite difficult, because you're always coming in late and people will say, thank you for this telegram, but actually I knew all about it. I've known all about it for the last 5 hours already. So why did you send the telegram? Part of, the changes in the diplomatic profession. I'll stop here. I know our time is running out, but thank you for wonderfully interesting questions. And I know I haven't answered all of them, but we need another hour or two. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ambassador. This was amazing, actually, given the range of questions we have bombarded you with. But there's more. So perhaps in the Q&A. So Vesko, would you like to bring those up.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger, for your thoughtful comments, insightful observations about international relations and the challenges ahead. We have a number of questions and 20 minutes left, so we have to do something almost impossible. I will try to address all the questions with your help. I put them in 4 baskets as far as the questions are concerned, and the first basket deals with NATO, Russia, Germany. The second, defense spending, NATO, Germany. The third, EU, Germany, and the fourth, cyber defense and the role of individuals. Let's begin briefly with the question about NATO, Germany. You addressed the myth of Russia's betrayal by the West, and I agree with you. If I may add, I would say that the myth emerged in the late 90s, in the Primakov era or post-Primakov era, around the time when the first round of NATO enlargement took place in 1999. But the question here, when it comes to you and Russia and NATO, is as a NATO member, how can the Germans support their energy needs through their partnership with Russia rather than by partnership with NATO members? And the second is, could you comment on the role of NATO and Germany in responding to growing regional threats from Russia? Then, when you address those two, then I will begin. I will open the new basket of questions.
All right. Well, the energy question, of course, is a question, as I understand it, focused on what we call Nord Stream 2, the pipeline projects that have been created over the last couple of decades, connecting Russian gas and oil directly through the Baltic Sea to Germany. Now, the important thing to know is that Germany, like most Central European partners, whether it's Slovakia or the Baltic countries or Poland and others, have, of course, for different reasons, been dependent on Russian fossil energy many decades. Our Eastern partners were dependent on Russian fossil fuel because they were members of the Warsaw Pact until 1992 or so. We in Germany started importing Russian fossil fuels many decades ago, and the classic argument by German policymakers and by German governments has been that even at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not try to squeeze us with the energy. And our thinking is that the Russians, or at the time the Soviet Union, understood very well that if they started to raise questions about the reliability of this relationship, they would shoot themselves into their own foot, because it is one of the few revenue sources that Russia has had, selling fossil fuel to the West. Now, energy, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I think if we had to start this project today, we would say no to it. But you have to remember that this project was put on the drawing board a number of years ago, at a time when, and I repeat, when we believed in something called mutual security, when we thought that there was a cooperative future between the West and Russia. Now, should the pipeline project be stopped now, sort of 5 minutes before its completion? That is, of course, what some are arguing. That is what the Trump administration has argued, what a number of US senators have argued. I'll share with you my own view. The German government has officially held for years that this is a commercial project driven by company interests, and we're not going to interfere with that. My personal view is that falls a little short of accepting the strategic significance of such energy projects, and I believe we will need to draw the correct conclusions from this experience of starting a project with a Russia, which we thought was going to be a cooperative partner, and the Russia today, which poisons their own opposition politicians and has created a rather nasty security atmosphere in Europe because of what happened in Ukraine, because of what happened in Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to elaborate. So here's my suggestion going forward. I believe we in Germany and we in Europe should propose to our transatlantic partner, to the United States, some kind of an energy security compact. Let me call it that. You can give it a different name. What would this compact, what would be the purpose of this compact? The purpose would be to try to work together to reduce dependencies, to increase diversification. We could, for example, agree in such a compact to build more LNG terminals throughout Europe, along the North Sea, along the Baltic, and even in the Mediterranean. Secondly, we could join forces, Americans and Europeans, to invest money into the necessary infrastructure to help our Eastern partners, those who are members of NATO and the EU, but also those who are not members of NATO and the EU, such as Ukraine, to modernize their energy infrastructure and to modernize the entire energy policy system, reduce their dependency on fossil fuel, which is much higher now than in the case of Germany, because we've been investing a lot of money in green energy and wind and solar, etc. We could finally also try to bolster our cooperation between European countries and the United States in terms of working together on Russia. We have not had an intense enough relationship recently. I would be very much in favor of a special consultative arrangement above and beyond NATO, because not all aspects of our commercial investment trading relationship are matters that are properly being discussed within the NATO framework. So I think we might want to have an additional arrangement in order to make sure that we know what the United States wants to do and the United States knows what our interests are, and we can share forces. So I apologize for this long response, but I wanted to share with you this idea about not simply discussing Nord Stream 2, but creating a larger framework where we would make sure that energy foreign policy is truly regarded as something that is not properly a national concern, but is a strategic concern about which we need to be consulting within NATO, within the EU, or in both instances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. Let us proceed with the second basket, almost like the OSCE 3 baskets. So the second basket relates to defense spending, and I have a few questions about it, and also a question about cyber defense. And you can imagine what type of questions they are. First is like a question concerning, how has the NATO community and the countries that it represents react to Trump's insistence that they actually pay their fair share of their defense rather than to give it lip service and have the US pick up the tab? I would add to this that it was not President Trump who brought this issue to the limelight. It was former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in 2011. I was at the time in NATO when he, made a famous speech about the need to spend more. The second question related to this is from the German perspective. It says that COVID has caused a contraction of the German economy, leading it to spend approximately 1.5% of its GDP on defense in 2020. As a result of it, members of the Green Party have called for a better measure of German NATO contribution. With the German general elections happening in 2021, the Greens currently poised to be second strongest party in the German Bundestag, and the SPD unlikely to go into another coalition with the CDU and SCU. How do you see potential impact on Green Party of that issue? And one related to the cyber defense issue is the question whether we can have some type of like a let's say global cyber defense center of excellence to help countries address cyber threats. I would add to it that NATO has established NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Riga, in Estonia, and it's not just open for NATO member states to join, but as far as I know, Austria is a member of it or cooperates with it. Please, can you address questions related to NATO and defense spending?
Yes, absolutely. Very good. Thank you so much. Well, as you said correctly, the NATO 2% spending goal in terms of national defense ambitions was not invented by the Trump administration. It goes back beyond. I remember when I was a young diplomat in Washington at the end of the 1970s, during the time when Jimmy Carter was beaten by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 elections. I remember writing, telegrams, diplomatic reports about the 3% goal. This was, of course, the time of the Cold War, and we were struggling to meet a 3% spending goal. And let's not forget the number of tanks and soldiers assembled in the two parts of Germany at the end of the 1980s was staggering. We had 700,000 German troops, 400 west, 300 east. We had hundreds of thousands of American troops, French troops, British troops, Belgian troops in West Germany, 350,000 or so Soviet troops in East Germany. When I was a kid or a student in Germany in the Cold War or before the Cold War period, fighter aircraft were flying over my little hometown village all the time. In other words, I have sympathy for those in Germany who in 1990, after reunification, said, thank you very much. Now we want the peace dividend because we've actually had a terrible time for the last 40 years. And these Germans listened to their leaders happily exclaiming, Germany is now a happy country because we are only surrounded by friends for the first time in history, which is true. It had never happened before that. We had not a single territorial or other serious conflict with any of our neighbors. So, paradise. So it is, one has to understand this in order to understand today that it is for some political parties, for some in Germany, not so easy to support the idea that we should spend significantly more on defense, which I think we should, and maybe a little less on COVID-19 and on hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not an easy debate. The problem has been, quite frankly, that the way the Trump administration has tried to play this 2% debate was, in my view, not exceedingly smart, because the impression was created in my country that if we want to meet the 2% defense goal, we would do it in order to please Donald Trump. And that, of course, was poisonous because no one liked Donald Trump. So why would we want to make Donald Trump happy if we don't like him in the first place? In other words, it would have been much better, and it will be much better, if we can demonstrate to our voters that what we need to do in terms of defense spending, in terms of defense capabilities, is what we need to do in order to protect our citizens, our borders, the future of Europe, and not simply to make the American president happy. So it's how you frame the narrative, and that didn't work out so well in the last couple of years. Now, on the cyber defense issue, no, let me add one final point just to be clear about this. The 2% goal is, fair enough, but it is, like most of these types of criteria, not perfect, because as you pointed out, if your GDP declines, as ours does, as everybody's does in the course of the pandemic recession, all of a sudden you meet the 2% goal more easily than if your GDP grows. So it's not a perfect way of measuring actual defense capabilities. I think that going forward, we should try to develop criteria which are more specifically geared to measuring capabilities. How many fighter aircraft can we actually deploy? What kind of brigade strength, combat brigades do we have? How many can be deployed overseas or in foreign countries, etc. That's a little more complicated than the simple 2% goal, but it may be more appropriate as we try to measure our defense spending. And quite frankly, just for those among your viewers, our defense spending, which was really very low because of the peace dividend discussion or so, has actually gone up, believe it or not, 40%, 40% over the last 4, 5, or 6 years. So it's not that we're not doing something about it, but moving as a large country that we are with a significant GDP, it's actually not so easy to spend billions of euros or dollars very quickly on defense. You need to develop the projects and you need to make sure that you can spend this money appropriately. Now, finally on cyber, I think the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence, I think it's, as you said, it's in Estonia, in Tallinn, and it's an excellent institution. We can probably make it more effective and build on it. I believe that technological advances are the single biggest, should be, and hopefully will be, the single biggest driver in the way that we approach our defense needs in the future. The recent conflict in Karabakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, has demonstrated the enormous impact which advanced drones can have in such localized, combat operations. As far as I know, the use by the deployment by the military of Azerbaijan of advanced drones literally guaranteed their military advances and their victory. In other words, the question that we need to ask ourselves in NATO is, does it make a lot of sense to keep investing in airplanes that are flown by humans, or should we not invest as much as we can into instruments that are like drones, run from behind, and with a reduced potential of losing human lives? I think that military technology is changing and has changed in an enormously quick fashion, and that's the real challenge for NATO and for the member countries of NATO, to make sure that we don't build the army of yesterday, but that we're capable of making the best possible use of artificial intelligence, of cyber technology, and of such technologies as the ones used in drones and related instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. I hope that we have 10 more minutes to address remaining questions, if you allow me. Let us unpack questions about the EU. Zucker zu Ende, which means cherry on the top. I have 2-3 questions regarding it. The first is concerning COVID-19 pandemic. And the question is whether the COVID-19 pandemic will drive Europe more apart or bring it together, like past crises that led to further integration. This is one question. The second is related to authoritarianism in Europe and within the European Union. The question is whether you see the growth of authoritarianism in Eastern and Central Europe as a serious threat to further European unification, or you see the talk from those leaders as simply rhetoric without real threat behind them. Also, do you predict Eastern European authoritarian leaders to turn away from the West and go further towards Russia and China now, maybe more to China, since Trump has lost the US election? And the final question is not related to it, but somehow has something to do with it. It is related to what you, with the framework of our discussion today. You were speaking and you were commenting on the world moving into a new era. How do you see the role of individual in society changing in this new era? What do you think the role of individuals or the individual would be in that world?
Thank you very much. So we go into another series of really interesting questions. The first question you asked was the one about the consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. Quite frankly, the initial reaction by most countries in Europe were modeled on the Trump administration's motto, America first. So it was Germany first, Italy first, Spain first, etc. Turns out that we have learned over the last 6 or 8 months that was not the best possible response. That the best possible response to the pandemic is to pool our resources, to pool and share, and to make the best use of our existing institutions. So I'm happy to say that by the early summer, we had recovered from this initial temptation to go separate ways, German way, an Austrian way, a Spanish way. And we ended up, as I'm sure you're all aware, we ended up taking a historic step in allowing the European Union to create a program where 750 billion euros would be made available through a debt system, which I don't want to go into because it's a little complicated, but it is the first time that the member states agreed that the European Union could have such a vehicle in order to be able to disperse more funding, more funds, more resources to the member states to soften the blow of the impact of COVID-19. In other words, we did what intelligent British leaders told us a long time ago. I'm not sure it was Winston Churchill. Most people mention Winston Churchill when they mention this sentence, but the sentence is very simple: never waste a crisis. Never waste a crisis. And I think we're not wasting the crisis. We're using the crisis to drive the European Union into a new era, which is never easy because you needed 28 in the future. You need 27 countries to agree, and that is often a big hassle. Not so easy. Now, the other question you asked was about authoritarianism in Europe and what do you think about it? Here, I would say the ending the Trump administration and the beginning of a Biden administration will make an enormous difference in this respect. Even though we're talking about something in Europe, American leadership will matter greatly, will play a very significant role. Look, it will make a difference whether the Prime Minister of Hungary, gets a wonderfully friendly welcome at the White House, and at the same time, the German Chancellor is being snubbed by that same White House, or if these roles are reversed. So I believe that American leadership in opposing authoritarian governments, in opposing the abandoning, partnership and alliance, I think a future administration that will not define the European Union as a quote unquote foe, but as a key partner of the United States, that will be very important. As they say in Germany, der Ton macht die Musik. It is the tone that makes the music, and the tone will be one that will not be friendly, I hope, to those in Europe who advance authoritarian models of government and ideas. So I'm very confident that this incoming US administration will have a major impact, a good one, a positive one, on this battle that we have, as you do, between those who believe that a strong leader is what we need, and why do we need all these democratic election processes and checks and balances, etc. The German lesson of the 20th century is there is nothing more important than a stable system of checks and balances, a stable constitutional system that guarantees the rights of the individual, that casts in stone the rule of law, and that embodies the fundamental principles of human freedom and of democracy. That's, I hope, our permanent lesson from this awful 20th century, where my own nation has brought so much devastation to the world. And it's our duty to try to work with those who share this vision in order to limit the impact of this new authoritarianism that we see all over the place. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. As you said at one moment, der Ton macht die Musik. And I would say that we had the privilege to enjoy excellent musical performance. We ran a little bit more than we expected, but I would also add that it was worth every minute of our time this afternoon or this evening. I would like also to thank my colleagues who made it happen and who are with us, Daniela and Kaija, and from my point of I would like particularly to thank the audience for excellent questions. If you have something to add, please.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ambassador. This was wonderful. So much knowledge, so little time. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. We hope to see you again here at the center. Take care. Thank you so much, Kaija and Vesko. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. What an interesting event. Thank you so much.